You're listening to The People's Voice, June 16th to 23rd, 2024. While corporations rush to get their rainbow logos and branding out on social media, attacks on transgender people are being legislated across the country. Teachers can be fired for introducing age-appropriate books and topics about gender in the classroom, or even answering students' questions. Queer youth are still 5 times more likely to attempt suicide than straight kids, and about half of LGBTQ+ workers still feel they have to hide their relationships in order to avoid discrimination on the job. Conservative right-wingers, bourgeois ideologists, and religious fundamentalists depict the nuclear family as a holy and immutable institution, but the truth is that the family that we know today has not always existed. Monogamy historically emerged as a new family structure became centered around not emotion or love, but economic conditions. The Latin root of the word family traces back to the early Roman period, which used the word familia to describe the total number of slaves belonging to one man. Under feudalism, the lives of most workers were dominated by relations of production emerging out of the agrarian economy. Largely separated from other people outside the family, opportunities for any kind of sexual deviance were extremely rare. With the Industrial Revolution beginning in the 18th century, urbanization brought about not only free laborers, but a concentrated population with a certain anonymity where like-minded others could form relations, thus giving rise to the modern gay, lesbian, and bisexual identities. A certain degree of sexual autonomy emerged during this period, but it was still heavily policed by the church, state, medicine, law, and academia, enforcing the nuclear family as the norm. Deviant sexualities were pathologized, and entire categorizations of people based on their sexuality developed for the first time. As soon as queer people were free to come into existence, they were demonized and subjected to control and repression, a contradiction that continues to define sexuality under capitalism and the fight for LGBTQ+ liberation today. Queer oppression, like racism and sexism, serves to keep the working class divided and distracted, focused on splits among themselves, rather than the real split between the classes. The first Indian Day was established on June 21, 1945. In 1966, the federal government recognized June 21st as National Indigenous Peoples Day, and since 2009, the month of June has been commemorated as National Indigenous History Month. In 2024, we recognize June 21st as National Indigenous Peoples Day, while also celebrating a rare moment where the government has finally acted, in the case of the Rising Tide Haida Title Lands Agreement, which was signed in April. The legislation is described as monumental by the Union of BC Indian Chiefs and was endorsed by the BC Federation of Labour, which called it an important step towards justice for Indigenous peoples. The agreement and legislation faced plenty of opposition from the Conservative Party as well as the BC United Party, but the First Nations Leadership Council called out these two right-wing parties for their fear-instilling rhetoric, which politicizes the basic human rights of the Haida and serves only to incite racist backlash towards them and other Indigenous people. Today, land rights are still at risk in other parts of the country, with climate change spawning a new drive for theft of Indigenous land. In Ontario, the Great Clay Belt is presently being targeted by both government and agribusiness for large-scale agricultural expansion, which threatens to sweep away Indigenous people in order to deliver on private corporate interests. It's a proposal which sounds eerily similar to the land dispossession which occurred in the process of colonialization in the 18th and 19th century, only now at a more advanced stage of capitalist development. Chinese military drills began around Taiwan after the inauguration speech of Taiwan's new president, Lai Ching-te, which called for strengthening the sovereignty of Taiwan as an independent state. The president's remarks immediately drew the eye of Beijing, which regards Taiwan as a province of China. In this claim, China not only relies on historical fact, but also the consensus and opinion from around the world, the United Nations, and international law. The United States illogically both supports the One China policy while also pledging to defend Taiwan in the event that it needs defending. Lai came to power with 40% of the vote, meaning that 60% of the Taiwanese electorate voted for parties who were seeking a better relationship with Beijing. Today, there are 100 UN member states that formally recognize Taiwan as part of China. Only 9 countries recognize Taiwanese independence. In 2007, the UN rejected a bid by Taiwan for membership, acknowledging that Taiwan is part of China. Even the US and Australia formally accept the validity of the UN Resolution 2758, which recognizes China's sovereignty over Taiwan. The Lieutenant General of the US Indo-Pacific Command called for vigilance in response to China's aggression in the region, while failing to mention that he is the commander of 60% of the entire US naval and air force capacity situated within striking distance of China. China's foreign ministry simply repeated that Taiwan is an inalienable part of China's territory and urged the US to stop supporting separatist forces and meddling in China's internal affairs. Immediately following the announcement of the final election results on June 2nd, South Africa's president, Cyril Ramaphosa, called for the country's political parties to overcome their differences and find common ground. Ramaphosa's African National Congress received 40% of the vote in the election, making it the first time the ANC has failed to win a majority in South Africa's democratic elections. Many South African elites and foreign interests are strongly pressing for the ANC to ally with the right-wing Democratic Alliance, which is backed by the support of foreign interests in powerful countries like Britain and the US. In response to the election results and the swirling speculation of a governing coalition, the South African Communist Party has called on the ANC and its allies in the labor movement to maintain strategic consistency against neoliberalism. In denouncing the drive toward neoliberal economic restructuring, the South African Communist Party called out the Democratic Alliance Party for its election campaign, which opposed a national minimum wage, attacked collective bargaining, and threatened cuts to the country's national health insurance. To advance the interests of the working class, the South African Communist Party is calling on progressive forces to guide the interests of the working masses while opposing strategic adversaries. The interests of the working class encompass priorities such as large-scale employment creation to resolve the unemployment crisis through industrialization and economic transformation, poverty eradication, the implementation of a developmental and transformative macroeconomic policy to achieve these goals alongside other working class interests. The Canadian branches of Voice of Women for Peace and the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom recently sent a joint letter to the Governor-General Mary Simon opposing the Trudeau government's $38.6 billion plan to modernize NORAD, the North American Aerospace Defense Command. NATO is exercising its presence and training in the Arctic, holding its largest exercise earlier this year, which included the participation of over 1,000 Canadian Armed Forces. In 1989, when Simon was the president of the Inuit Circumpolar Council, she published an article warning that any excessive military buildup in the north only serves to divide the Arctic, perpetuates east-west tensions and the arms race, and puts our people on opposing sides. For these and other reasons, Arctic militarization is not in the interests of the Inuit in Canada, Russia, Alaska, and Greenland, nor do such military preparations further security or world peace. In May, Defense Minister Bill Blair and Foreign Affairs Minister Mélanie Joly were in Iqaluit, Nunavut, to promote Canada's new defense policy of expanding the military presence of NORAD and NATO in the north. Blair and Joly stated that military infrastructure will have civilian purposes as well, but overall, the priority will be in meeting the requirements of the US Department of Defense. Canada has signed contracts for 140 new tactical US-made aircraft, including F-35 fighter jets, P-8A Poseidon anti-submarine aircraft, attack helicopters, and MQ-9 Reaper armed drones. The government also plans to spend $60 billion for new surface combatants and is exploring the procurement of new submarines. But for Indigenous Inuit, who comprise half of Canada's Arctic population of 200,000, their territory is not a theater of war, and they would prefer that the fragile ocean ecosystem be protected and sustainably developed, not militarized. Blair and Joly recognize that the Arctic is warming 4 times faster than any other region in the country, but this should justify less militarism, not more. The federal government should be reducing emissions and investing to help northern communities adapt to climate change and become more resilient. For reconciliation and climate justice, the Trudeau government must withdraw from NORAD and NATO and cancel its plans to militarize the North and work collaboratively to make the Arctic a zone of peace, free from nuclear weapons. That's all for now. If you're interested in strengthening working class press here in Canada, consider lending your support to the People's Voice Fund Drive at pvonline.ca/donate.